This presentation introduces topic 4403, Implementation and Evaluation of Local Climate Action. The central argument is that climate ambition only becomes meaningful when it is translated into decisions, budgets, responsibilities, and monitoring arrangements at the local level. Municipalities are where climate goals meet land use, infrastructure, mobility, buildings, public health, and everyday service delivery. For that reason, this lecture is not only about writing climate plans, but also about understanding how plans move from strategy to implementation and how they are evaluated before, during, and after delivery. The presentation also looks at co-production, policy learning, and multi-level governance because local action rarely succeeds in isolation. It depends on how local institutions interact with national frameworks, finance, networks, and communities. The overall aim is to show that strong local climate action is iterative, evidence-based, participatory, and realistic about capacity and constraints. The agenda moves from broad framing to practical implementation. We begin by explaining why the local level matters so much for climate governance and why municipal action is now a central arena for both mitigation and adaptation. We then briefly situate local planning within wider global and regional frameworks such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the European Green Deal, but only to the extent needed to understand local action. After that, the lecture focuses on the internal structure of municipal climate action plans, the pathways through which actions are delivered, and the policy instruments available to local governments. The second half of the presentation addresses administrative capacity, policy learning, co-production, and evaluation. Finally, the lecture closes with two case studies: the Barcelona Climate Plan, which highlights participation and co-production, and the Polish Municipal Adaptation Plan program, which illustrates questions of plan credibility and quality. The learning objectives for topic 4403 are reproduced from the official learning outcomes document. They require students to understand the basic concepts of global climate governance, the principles behind major international agreements, the role of regional initiatives such as the European Green Deal, and the significance of finance, carbon markets, and national commitments. They also require an attitude dimension, awareness of environmental responsibility and collaborative action for a climate-resilient future. In this lecture, those outcomes are approached through a local action lens. In other words, global frameworks are treated as enabling and structuring conditions for municipal delivery rather than as an abstract policy history. Every body slide therefore supports at least one of the formal learning outcomes while keeping the analytical weight on implementation, evaluation, and local credibility. This matters because students should leave the topic not only understanding climate governance, but also recognizing what makes a local climate plan realistic, actionable, and publicly defensible. Local climate action matters because local government is where climate governance becomes operational. Cities and municipalities influence emissions through buildings, transport systems, procurement, land use controls, waste systems, public facilities, and urban infrastructure. They also face direct exposure to climate risks such as heat, flooding, drought, public health stress, and infrastructure disruption. This means the local scale is both a source of climate impact and a front line of climate vulnerability. It is also the scale closest to citizens, firms, and community organizations, so it has a uniquely practical relationship with implementation. Unlike national declarations, local plans often need to specify who will do what, in which department, with which resources, and on what timeline. Local climate action therefore turns abstract commitments into operational choices. It links political ambition with delivery systems, and it reveals whether climate governance is actually embedded in ordinary public administration or remains symbolic and disconnected from real urban decision-making. Even though topic 4403 is centered on local implementation, local plans are shaped by wider governance frameworks. The Kyoto Protocol is historically important because it introduced binding targets for industrialized parties and helped establish climate policy as a formal international field. The Paris Agreement broadened that logic by emphasizing universal participation, nationally determined contributions, recurring ambition cycles, and transparency. These features matter locally because they create long-term expectations for planning, reporting, and alignment. At the regional scale, the European Green Deal adds regulatory direction, funding signals, and institutional momentum for decarbonization and resilience. For municipalities, these frameworks do not automatically generate effective action, but they influence what is politically possible, financially attractive, and strategically visible. Local plans often translate higher-level goals into sectoral priorities such as mobility, energy, buildings, nature-based solutions, and adaptation. The key point is that local action sits inside a larger architecture, but still requires place-specific design and implementation choices. National commitments, finance, and carbon market mechanisms also shape local feasibility. Nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, define how countries frame mitigation and adaptation priorities under the Paris system. Municipalities often work more effectively when their own plans can align with those national directions, because alignment improves legitimacy, funding fit, and policy coherence. Climate finance matters in a similarly practical way. Many municipalities can identify sensible actions, but without finance they cannot move beyond planning, pilot projects, or fragmented implementation. Financing determines whether cities can build project pipelines, hire staff, develop data systems, and sustain delivery over time. Carbon market mechanisms, especially those associated with Article 6, introduce another consideration. Robust accounting and institutional capacity are essential if climate claims are to remain credible. For local governments, the lesson is not that every city must master carbon markets, but that local action becomes stronger when it is aware of national rules, financing conditions, and the wider systems that shape implementation opportunities. A municipal climate action plan becomes actionable only when goals, actors, resources, and indicators are clearly linked. A strong plan usually begins with a baseline that defines local emissions, climate risks, vulnerabilities, and relevant sector conditions. From there, the plan needs targets, timelines, and a planning horizon that make progress accessible. It should then organize an action portfolio by sector, covering both mitigation and adaptation where possible. Just as important, the plan should identify responsible actors, implementation partners, funding expectations, and monitoring indicators. Without those elements, even a well-written strategy can remain aspirational. Strong plans also specify revision triggers and reporting routines so they can respond to new data, shifting risk conditions, or implementation setbacks. In short, the core architecture of a municipal climate action plan is not merely a list of good ideas. It is an organizational design that connects diagnosis, action, accountability, and learning in a form that public institutions can actually use. Implementation pathways are the bridge between a plan document and real-world change. Some actions sit inside direct municipal control, such as energy use in public buildings, fleet electrification, procurement rules, public space design, or emergency preparedness. Other actions require influence rather than command, for example changing mobility behavior, supporting private retrofits, encouraging distributed energy, or improving neighborhood-level resilience. For that reason, implementation usually combines internal operations, regulatory tools, partnerships, investment programs, and community-facing services. A practical municipal portfolio often spans buildings, infrastructure, mobility, land use, public health, and adaptation to hazards such as heat and flooding. It may also aim for county benefits, for example linking resilience with health, equity, air quality, or energy affordability. The important lesson is that action pathways differ by sector and governance capacity. Local plans become stronger when they distinguish between what the municipality can directly deliver, what it can enable, and what requires coordination with outside actors or higher-level institutions. Local governments typically rely on a mix of policy instruments rather than a single tool. Regulatory instruments include zoning, building requirements, standards, and procurement rules. These are powerful because they can embed climate objectives in binding and repeatable decisions. Financial instruments include municipal budgets, grants, co-funding arrangements, and incentives that help move projects from intention to implementation. Soft instruments include guidance, awareness campaigns, convening, information sharing, and voluntary initiatives. These are useful for behavior change and coalition building, but they are usually weaker if used alone. Institutional instruments are less visible but often decisive. They include coordination routines, staff mandates, interdepartmental procedures, and the incorporation of climate criteria into ordinary administrative workflows. In practice, implementation tends to be more durable when climate goals enter regular decision systems rather than remaining in standalone projects. A strong instrument mix therefore reflects the reality of multi-level governance. Local action works best when binding, financial, organizational, and communicative tools reinforce one another. Implementation inside local government depends on organizational conditions as much as on technical design. Political mandate matters because climate action can lose momentum when leadership changes or when priorities shift under budget pressure. Administrative capacity matters because plans require staff time, coordination, procurement skills, data management, and follow-up. Many municipalities face capacity constraints that make even sensible plans difficult to deliver. Cross-department coordination is another recurring issue. Climate action cuts across transport, planning, environment, public works, social policy, finance, and health, so siloed working habits can block implementation. External support can therefore be important, whether through national programs, provincial frameworks, issue-specific networks, or intermunicipal cooperation. Yet support alone is not enough. Each action still needs ownership. Someone must know they are responsible, with at least minimal authority and resources to move it forward. The broader lesson is that implementation fails less often because of weak ambition than because climate goals are not embedded in everyday organizational routines and accountability structures. Policy learning is a central theme in the literature because cities rarely start from zero and rarely succeed through perfect first designs. Municipalities learn from previous measures, from comparison with peer cities, and from the networks through which climate policy ideas travel. However, one of the most important cautions is that best practice is not simply transferable. An action that performs well in one city may depend on institutional, financial, climatic, or political conditions that do not exist elsewhere. That is why policy learning requires interpretation, not imitation. Local governments need the capacity to adapt borrowed ideas to their own context. They also need reflexive learning, the ability to review past implementation, recognize gaps, and change course. Networks can support this process by sharing methods, indicators, and lessons, but municipalities still need internal capability to learn. In practical terms, policy learning improves local climate action when it reduces repetition of known mistakes and strengthens the quality of future planning cycles. Co-production and participation matter because climate plans affect everyday urban life and because local knowledge can improve both legitimacy and effectiveness. Participation is strongest when it begins early, before a plan is finalized, rather than being used only to validate decisions that have already been made. Co-production can combine formal expertise with situated knowledge from communities, civil society, professional groups, and affected stakeholders. This can reveal barriers, priorities, and social impacts that technical planning alone may miss. Participation can also strengthen uptake because people are more likely to support measures they understand and have had some role in shaping. However, participation is not automatically transformative. It requires clear roles, realistic expectations, appropriate methods, and visible feedback so contributors know how input was used. Digital tools can increase access and transparency, while face-to-face engagement can deepen deliberation and trust. The practical lesson is that participation should be institutionalized as part of implementation quality, not treated as a symbolic add-on. Recent evidence from climate action plans shows why implementation and evaluation deserve so much attention. A recent review of 157 U.S. city climate action plans published between 2018 and 2023 suggests that many plans remain heavily planning-oriented and internally focused. A notable share of strategies targeted municipal operations rather than wider urban systems, and a substantial proportion of plans prioritized further planning and assessment rather than immediate delivery. Energy and mobility received the strongest attention, while other areas were more unevenly treated. Although this evidence is geographically specific, the pattern is instructive for a much broader audience. It suggests that municipalities often produce plans that are serious in intent but narrow in sector focus and cautious in implementation commitment. The takeaway is not that these plans lack value. Rather, it is that plan production can become an end in itself unless evaluation criteria distinguish clearly between strategic preparation, institutional readiness, and actual delivery capacity across a broader set of local systems. The literature also identifies recurring plan quality and delivery gaps. One common issue is overemphasis on municipal internal operations at the expense of wider territorial transformation. Internal operations are important, but they rarely capture the full climate challenge of a city or region. Another gap is the tendency to privilege diagnostics, vulnerability assessments, or future studies without equally strong implementation arrangements. Plans may therefore be rich in analysis but weak in delivery mechanisms. Weak cross-sector integration is another problem, especially where climate action is compartmentalized rather than linked to planning, health, housing, food systems, or water management. The treatment of equity and vulnerable groups is also often uneven, despite the fact that climate impacts and policy burdens are socially differentiated. These gaps matter because they reduce both effectiveness and credibility. A plan may appear technically sophisticated while still avoiding the most difficult questions about distribution, finance, accountability, and the scale of intervention needed for meaningful local climate action. Before implementation is complete, local stakeholders still need a way to judge whether a plan is credible. Ex-ante credibility assessment answers that need. One dimension is substance. Does the plan rest on a sound diagnosis, coherent actions, realistic sequencing, and a defensible connection between identified problems and proposed responses? Does it acknowledge uncertainty and local conditions rather than assuming generic solutions? A second dimension is governance. Are responsibilities assigned, financing considered, participation built in, and monitoring arrangements specified? A credible plan does not guarantee success, but it provides evidence that implementation has at least been designed in a serious and testable way. This matters especially for adaptation, where outcomes can be difficult to observe quickly and where symbolic planning can persist for years without clear impact. By assessing credibility before delivery, local governments and evaluators can identify weak points early and improve the plan before resources are spent, expectations are raised, or communities are exposed to avoidable implementation failure. Evaluation and monitoring should be understood as a continuous learning cycle rather than as a final reporting exercise. Ex-ante review helps assess quality before implementation starts. Process tracking then asks whether actions are actually moving forward, who is responsible, what has been funded, what barriers have emerged, and where delays are occurring. Outcome indicators go one step further by examining whether mitigation and adaptation effects are becoming visible, while equity and co-benefit checks help ensure that action is not judged only by narrow technical metrics. Periodic revision is essential because local conditions, technologies, risks, and political priorities change over time. Evaluation should therefore feed directly into reprioritization and the next planning cycle. In this sense, monitoring is not a bureaucratic afterthought. It is part of implementation itself. Strong local climate governance depends on being able to test assumptions, identify underperforming measures, and revise portfolios in light of evidence rather than defending the original plan as if it were fixed and complete. When the supplied literature is synthesized, several best practice principles become clear. First, local plans should align upward with national and regional frameworks, but they must still be tailored to local conditions. Second, municipalities should use a balanced instrument mix rather than relying only on soft measures or aspirational statements. Third, goals need to be linked to named responsibilities so actions do not disappear into collective vagueness. Fourth, implementation must be resourced. Planning alone is not enough if financing, staff time, and procedural authority are missing. Fifth, participation and feedback should be institutionalized so public engagement contributes to ongoing learning rather than one-off consultation. Finally, climate plans should be treated as living documents that are revised as evidence accumulates. These principles sound straightforward, but they are demanding in practice because they require political discipline, administrative coordination, and openness to adaptation. Nevertheless, together they form a practical test of whether a municipal climate plan is likely to move from strategy to durable implementation. The Barcelona Climate Plan is a valuable case because it illustrates both the promise and the limits of co-produced local climate planning. The process involved workshops that generated a large share of proposals from organizations, and it also used a digital participation platform to widen lay involvement and increase transparency. This combination showed that local climate planning can open space for broader civic input rather than being confined to technical experts or municipal departments. At the same time, the case also revealed important constraints. Shared understanding of what co-production actually meant was not always strong, and institutional reluctance, time limits, and process pressures reduced the transformative potential of participation. In other words, participation created opportunities, but those opportunities were shaped by organizational context and by how seriously the municipality was prepared to incorporate external input. The main lesson is that co-production works best when objectives, roles, and follow-through mechanisms are clear. Otherwise, participation may be visible, but its impact on implementation quality can remain limited. The Polish Municipal Adaptation Plan case illustrates a different but equally important issue: ex-ante credibility under a nationally supported program. Adaptation plans were prepared for 44 large Polish cities between 2015 and 2019 with institutional and expert support. This national scaffolding accelerated uptake and helped cities produce plans at scale. The case demonstrates the value of standard guidance, expert assistance, and program structure when municipalities might otherwise struggle to begin adaptation planning. Yet the study also shows that credibility varied across plans. While many were broadly credible, weaker points often included financing, equity and justice, and the depth of community participation. This means standardized programs can improve consistency and speed, but they do not automatically solve local ownership, resource adequacy, or social inclusion. The broader lesson is that implementation quality depends on both system-level support and municipal commitment. National frameworks can open doors, but strong local adaptation still requires context-specific governance arrangements, realistic funding, and meaningful engagement with the communities affected by climate risk. To conclude, implementation and evaluation are what separate local climate action from symbolic planning. The lecture has shown that local plans serve as the delivery bridge between higher-level climate commitments and concrete municipal decisions. Their quality depends on whether they connect evidence, targets, instruments, actors, resources, and monitoring in a form that institutions can actually use. Effective implementation depends on instrument choice, organizational capacity, coordination, learning, and participation. Effective evaluation depends on reviewing credibility early, tracking delivery honestly, and revising plans as evidence emerges. The case studies reinforce that neither participation nor standardization is sufficient on its own. Both need follow-through, resources, and institutional commitment. The broader message of Topic 4403 is therefore practical as well as normative. Strong local climate action is collaborative, iterative, and accountable. It is built not only through ambition, but through the disciplined work of turning climate goals into durable public decisions, measurable progress, and improved resilience over time.